2024 Code of Georgia, Title 31 Health, Chapter 33 Health Records Definitions. As using this chapter, the term when the patient means of the person who will receive health care service, the provider means all hospitals, including public, private, osteopathic, tuberculosis hospitals, other than special care units of the pediatric facility, for the nursing facility, kidney disease treatment centers include with a freestanding with a hemodialysis units, intermediate care facilities, ambulatory surgical obstetric facilities, health maintenance organization, human health agencies should also mean with a person licensed to practice under Chapter 9, 11, 26, 34, 35, and 39 or Title 43. Records mean a patient health care included but not limited to the evaluation, diagnosis, prognosis, laboratory reports, x-rays, prescriptions of the technical information used to assess the patient's condition, pertinent portion of recording relating specific conditions, summary of the record. Furnishing copy of the records of the patient provided with an unauthorized person. A provider having custody control over the evaluation, diagnosis, prognosis, laboratory report with a biopsy with a child with a patient record with obtaining with such information period with not less than 10 years from such of the date item was created with the requirements of the subparagraph A with the paragraph shall not apply with the individual provided with the reported from and the sole of his or her personal practice if the provider with the notified with the patient such of the retirement shall with the offender with the provide such items patient record copy with the provider with the patient choice of the patient so the requested of the patient or of the hospital the institution that defines subparagraph A with the paragraph 4 of the code section 3171 which shall the return of the record with accordance with the rules regulations for the hospital with the issue of the pursuant of the code section 3172 upon written request from the patient or the person authorized to accept the patient records under advanced directive of the healthcare psychiatric advanced directive of the general power over the attorney for the healthcare search for the patient with the provider with the custody with the control of the patient record shall furnish a complete current copy of the record accordance with the provision of the code section of the patient with the deceased such with the request made with the following person with the executive of the administrator of the temporary administrator of the deceased estate with the trust person has been appointed executive administrator of the temporary administrator of the descendant of the estate with has not been appointed with the surviving spouse with the no serve with the spouse with the surviving child with the no surviving child with any of the parent. Any record request is subsection A with the code section shall within 30 days of the receipt of the request for the record furnished with the patient and the other provided with the destiny with the patient with the person authorized with the paragraph 2 subsection A code section request with the patient with the deceased patient with the brackets for the name of the person designated with the patient such with the recorded request as accompanied by the authorization plan for federal health insurance with the portability accountability 1996 United States 42 United States Code section 1320 D2 Tennessee with regulation implementation such act signed written authorization specified subsection D with the code section provided reasonably determined with the disclosure of the record patient with a detrimental with the physical mental health of the patient provider may refuse with the furniture of the record however upon such refusal of the patient with the record shall over the upon written request of the patient with the furniture over the provider the designated with the patient. A provider shall not require the release of the record accordance code section unless and still of the requesting person with the furniture of the provider with the sign with the written authorization indicating that he or she is authorized to access patient's record paragraph 2 subsection A with the code section A with the provider shall be justified with the relying on such written authorization provider person with the good faith of the release of the copy of medical record in the corner of the code section shall not found to have with the violated criminal law with the civil liability patient with the deceased patient with the estate with any of your person. Alright, cost of copying mail and patient rights with the record with the applicability psychiatric, psychological, mental health records. Over the party with the requesting when the patient is the record with the other responsible to provide with the cost of the copy of the mailing procedure with the record of the chain of the $20 with the collective with the trip of the retrieval of the directive of the administrator with the cost of complying with the request on the chapter of the fee with the certified with the medical record may also be charged with the not exceed with the $11.50 with the record certified with the actual with the cost of the postage incurred with the mailing of the request record may also be charged with in addition the copy and copy of the record with which within the paper form with the not exceed 75 cents per page for the first 20 pages of the patient with the record copy with the 65 pair page over the 21 to 100 pages 50 cents each of the page copy with except for the 100 page of all of the fees allowed with the code section with the adjusted with the annually in accordance with the medical component with the customer price index from the community health with the reasonable with the calculated with the annual adjustment with the becoming in effect of July 1st each year with the extent with the request of the medical records include with the portion of the records which were not in paper form included not limited to the pathology films modeled with a fetal, with monitoring strips of the provider, with the consent, with the recovery, with the overruns, full cost, with the show, with the reproduction, and the payment of the source, with the cost, with the required, with the provided, with the private, with the record, with the being furnished. Subsection shall not apply with the records requested in order to make the complete application of the disability benefits program and the rights of the grant with the patient, with the other person, with the end of the chapter, with the addition, with the of the rights, such as with the patient, or person have with the validating access with the patient, with the records, however, with nothing in the chapters, with the construe, with the granting, with the patient, with the person, with the right, the ownership of the record, with the records are owned with the end or property with the provider. Code section shall apply with the psychiatric, psychological, and mental health records of the patient. Mental health records of the vision, chapter starts with the X, otherwise provided with the under code section 3133.3, 3133.7, and 3133 shall not apply with the psychiatric, psychological, or mental health records of the patient. Immunity, liability with the releasing information provided with the releasing information, good faith with the presumption of the provision of chapter not civilly, criminally liable the patient, with the guardian of the parent, any other person such as the release. Nothing in the chapter should contribute to the destroying of the diminishing of the purpose of the confidential nature of the communication now and the hereafter of the recognized by law. Nothing was furnishing copies of the psychological, psychological, psychiatric evaluation law enforcement officer upon request. Nothing in the provision code section 3133.4 of the law enforcement officer of the imposed of the officer of the employed government entity with the required to submit with the psychological, psychiatric examination process assessing the law enforcement officer with the fitness of the due with the employee status. Employment staff at the time of the duties of the upon with the written request of the law enforcement officer, the employer shall furnish the law enforcement officer with a complete copy of the evaluation of the report. Employer or healthcare provider furnishing of the making of the report evaluation good faith with the pursuit of the provision of the code section shall not be civilly, criminally liable with the law enforcement officer or any other person furnishing or making such report evaluation. If an owner responsible determined for the disclosure of the evaluation report of the law enforcement officer of the will be detriment of the mental health of the law enforcement of the law enforcement officer would present risk or harm to other persons would involve the disclosure of confidential information would violate the privacy of the third party of the employer may refuse the furnishing of the record of the evaluation provided. However, upon such a refusal of the evaluation of the report upon written request of the law enforcement officer may be furnished by the employer to with a psychiatric, psychological treating of the law enforcement officer. And that was 3133.7. Furnishing copies of psychological psychiatric evaluation to law enforcement officer upon request. Electronic records application of psychiatric, psychological, other mental health records. Nothing withstanding of the provision of the law, contrary with the provider of the main soul, of the secretion, create, with the maintain, with the transmit, with the receive, with the store, with the record, with the electronic format, meaning code section 1012, with the two, with the made, with the assist, with the discretion, with the temporary, permanent, with the cover, convert, with the record, with the electronic format, provide with the show, with the network, with the maintain, separate, with the tangible, the copy, the electronic storage record, with the other provision, with the chapter shall apply with the electronic records, same in the extent of the provisions apply with the tangible records. Code section subject with the applicable, the federal law, with the general security, with the confidential patient, with the person, or with the health information, tangible copy, with the record, with the procedure, with the electronic show, with the record, with the share, with the original person providing copy of the patient, with the other authorized party, with the introduction of the record, with the into the evidence administrative of the court proceeding, except with the provided with the otherwise from the federal law, upon receipt of the request of the copy of the record, with the patient authorized under the code section 3133.3, with the provider shall provide with a copy of the record, with either for the tangible electronically stored form, subsection A, B, D, and E, with the code section of the shall apply with the psychiatric, with the psychological, and the other mental health records of the patient. And that was code section health records of the Code of Health, Code of Georgia health records, electronic records, application, psychiatric, psychological, or other mental health records.